Well, welcome everybody. Really excited to have you here today. I'm Sean Fullerton. I'm a member of CFA Boston's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and moderator of today's discussion. I'm really excited for today's discussion. We've got amazing speakers. We've got Kim and Noah, who are the co-founders of Kahilla. We have Amy and Scott, who head up programs at Forte. Of course, we have Erinn King, who you all know from her role as CFA Boston chairperson in 2019. I also want to thank folks on our committee, in particular, Ilana Rim and Tiffany Hu, for doing all the hard work that it took to get this event started. And also thank Jamie, whose tech and presentation help is just so incredibly valuable. Pretty soon, I'm going to pass the mic to our panelists to do a little bit more of an introduction of themselves. But first, I want to address one of the elephants in the room, which is that we have, I think, really great gender diversity represented today, but we don't have good racial diversity represented. And I think that allyship on both gender and race are incredibly important. In particular, as you saw perhaps in the invite to this webinar, 8 in 10 investment professionals are white, and only 1 in 10 portfolio managers are women. And that's despite the fact that research from McKinsey and Willis Towers Watson has found that diverse investment teams and organizations perform better. So today's discussion, I think, necessarily will focus a little bit more on the gender lens, but our hope for the future is to have allyship conversations specific to people of color, the LGBTQ+ community, people with disabilities, and other important groups. So today what we're going to cover is, what is allyship? Then we're going to talk about making allyship real in your life. And then finally, best practices around allyship. So after our panelists introduce themselves, we're going to do a quick poll as well. Please respond to the poll. And we want to have this be kind of interactive with all of you. So please do submit questions through the chat. You'll see that there's an option to write in Q&A. Don't do that. There's a chat thing that you should send it through, because we might not see you if you send it to the Q&A. So with that, perhaps Amy, do you want to, Amy and Scott, do you want to spend a minute or two introducing Forte?
Sure. First of all, apologies to the audience. I don't usually look this suspicious. Last minute change of plans, and I'm in a different location. But and if I lose connectivity, my colleague Scott is going to sub for me. But I'm Amy Orlov, and my colleague Scott Brownlee. We both work at Forte, which is a nonprofit really aimed at getting more women into leadership via education and business careers. We really feel like the MBA degree is the gateway to leadership in so many ways. That's really all I'll say about Forte, other than we're an alliance of about 160 leading business schools, companies, and undergraduate institutions. And if you want more information, you can look us up at www.fortefoundation.org.
Oh gosh, I put myself on mute. I thought that'd be helpful, but it's at any rate. Okay, well, thank you so much, Amy. Let me pass it to Kim and Noah to talk about Kahilla.
Hi, thank you for having us today, Sean. I'm Kim Havens, one of the co-founders of Kahilla.
I'm Noah Ries, the other co-founder.
And we like to describe Kahilla as a mashup of the networking of LinkedIn with the live and on-demand aspects of Peloton. So we like to call it edutainment. But if you can imagine, we have a platform where it hosts everything from executive coaching sessions to content and community.
And our mission and really our vision is to transform the culture of the corporate world by making senior leadership more representative of the world that we live in. So our mission is really to provide equitable, democratized access to leadership development in order to see more diverse talent advance into senior leadership. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then Erinn, I know you wanted to share a little bit about some of the work you've been doing on the CFA Institute DEI code.
Thank you so much, Sean. And as you mentioned, in my role and honor as a past president of the board for CFA Society Boston, I continue in my final year now as a board member, and I've had an honor of being a part of this smaller working group along with fellow board member Keon Holmes for CFA Institute in developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion code. This is similar to the Asset Manager Code of Conduct or our Code of Ethics in that it is very much designed for the investment and asset management community and industry. And there's 6 key principles. They're pipeline, talent acquisition, promotion and retention, leadership, influence, and measurement. And the goal here is really to drive progress without being prescriptive. We recognize one size does not fit all, but also a real focus on sharing best practices and holding ourselves as an industry accountable for this progress. And so the comment period has closed. We're evaluating the feedback with the hope of launching the code here in the coming months to the broader community. And we sincerely hope that Boston will be an early adopter and leader on these fronts. So thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you, Erinn. So I told you all that we had amazing panelists, and they just proved it to you. I'm just so excited for today's chat. So let's see. So I'm going to say it again. If you have questions, please submit them through the chat, not through the Q&A. We really want to get your questions. We want this to be an interactive opportunity for us to answer the real questions of folks within the CFA Boston community. So send them in. But before we do that, we're going to do the poll. So Jamie, would you mind bringing that up? So hopefully you should all be able to see the poll on your screen. How confident are you in your knowledge of allyship? Somewhat is the #1 response. Very little, none. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not surprised to hear this. I think that it's a really, really important thing for us all to know about, and it doesn't get talked about enough necessarily. So I think this is perfect. It gives us a sense of where we should take this conversation. So thank you all for responding to the poll. So let's talk about what is allyship and hopefully answer that question and make you all experts on the topic. What is allyship? What's the objective of allyship? And how does it apply across gender, class, race, immigrant status, and other areas? And maybe Amy, if you wouldn't mind starting us off on that question.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm actually gonna punt it over to Scott.
Sure.
Scott, can I ask you?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. So I'll go ahead and throw up in the chat the definition of allyship that Amy and I use when we do gender equity trainings, both in corporate environments and with business school students. And we define it as a supportive association you form with another person or group that is marginalized or mistreated, to which you do not personally belong, right? So we draw that delineation there. And ideally, this association that you're forming with this group that you don't belong to is persistent and ongoing, right? So we think about allyship as a process rather than a final result. And when that poll came up, I smiled because I don't think I could even select vary in terms of the knowledge, because I feel like it's a changing landscape in terms of the lexicon of allyship. But in terms of the objective of allyship, I like to think about it in terms of we're trying to move toward equity rather than equality, right? And as kind of a baseline for kind of fairness in the workplace in this case. And the metaphor we like to use at Forte is a bicycle, right? And if we give everyone in the workplace the same metaphorical bicycle, right? And think of the bicycle as the tools that they have to be successful at work, right? If we give everyone the same bike, well, there's going to be if we say this bike is designed for 6'2" white men like myself, from Texas, other folks are gonna say, gonna think, and rightfully so, like, well, this I can't ride this bike. I'm 5 feet tall. I need a different bike, right? So we think about the difference between equity and equality you can have equality, right? You can give everyone the same bicycle, but you don't get equity, right? You don't get that outcome of everyone actually being able to use the bike effectively. So when we think about allyship at Forte, we use that bike metaphor, and I think that's helpful. Hopefully for audience members, if you're new to this topic, you'll think about that bike metaphor whenever you're thinking about what we're trying to accomplish with allyship. And then in terms of, to answer your question, Sean, what does it mean in the broader kind of social inequity context? Like, how does allyship play out? I think that there's going to be different scenarios where you're in allyship for different groups, right? But there's certainly overlap, and there's certainly kind of best practices that can apply working with different groups across the identity spectrum. At Forte, we started off doing trainings around gender equity allyship, but really quickly, right? It's really hard to talk about gender equity without talking about racial equity, right? Because those two things really tie together. And there's other identities you can bring in there too, right? With LGBTQ plus communities. And so pretty quickly what happens, and a lot of times folks that are resistant to the allyship conversation will say, well, there's too many groups, there's too many things, like, it's too confusing. So I like to kind of take a step back and always say, we can have a conversation about a specific identity group, in this case, gender equity at Forte, but we're also going to have that intersectional conversation too, right? What is that? What does it mean to be an ally for women, broadly, but also women of color more specifically, and kind of deepen that conversation. So that's kind of how we start to parse it out.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That's very thoughtful. I want to dive into one of the things that you mentioned right kind of toward the beginning of your comments, which was that allyship needs to be ongoing. And so, I've heard the term before that allyship is a verb, not a noun. And I don't know if that resonates with all of you or not. I'd love to get your perspectives, and maybe, I don't know, Kim and Noah, do you want to share any thoughts on that?
Sure. So I'd love to ask the audience, comment in the chat, just a yes or a no, if you've ever bought a gym membership and never used it. Yeah. I think everyone's probably been guilty of it at some point. Yeah. Well, allyship is not like that. If you don't do it, you are not practicing allyship. As Scott shared, it's persistent, it's ongoing, which alludes to the fact that it's a verb. It's something that requires doing. It's a process. You need to be constantly in the process and practice of learning and unlearning, doing, and also it's not something that you can self-proclaim. It is something that is bestowed upon you. You need to be an ally for somebody else. As Scott so eloquently shared, it's being a supportive person to a group or a person of which you do not personally belong, but you can't self-proclaim yourself as an ally. As I said at the beginning, just like you can't, unfortunately, get fit without actually showing up to the gym, you also need to get out of the stands. You can't be a spectator in allyship. You actually need to have boots on the ground, reading, committing to doing the work constantly. Reading, learning, unlearning, and practicing, as you shared. It's a verb. It's not a noun.
Thank you.
No, if I can jump in for a minute and let you know that one of the ways, because we obviously share the same belief when it comes to that. One of the things we always like to say is you can be empathetic, but so if you think about active empathy, that could be maybe a synonym, if you will, for allyship, right? Because until you take action, there's no meaning there. So when it comes to allyship, so we like to say it's active empathy a lot.
Now I have a question kind of from where I sit, I guess. I'm gonna ask in a second, but I also want to ask you all in the audience to please put in some questions. I mean, this is an opportunity to learn from experts here, or as Scott said, people who are still learning, but have done a good deal of learning. So I want to ask the question about, I guess myself, and I think, to be honest, many people in CFA Boston are white men. And I know that there's a certain amount of anxiety, frankly, around engaging in the topic of allyship, or just even more broadly in the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think some of the questions that people might ask themselves are, am I using the right vocabulary? Might I be judged for my opinions or what I say? And so I guess, what would you say to somebody in my shoes, or, about, I guess, those questions, whether, how should we feel about those questions?
Yeah. Do you, go ahead. Kim, were you going to say something?
Sure.
I saw you
go
took
ahead.
yourself on mute.
Go ahead, Amy, if you had something to say there, and I can
Well,
add to it.
I was just gonna say, I wanted to dive in here because I feel like that is so common that people don't want to get into this conversation because they're afraid to make a misstep or to say something incorrectly. And there are two rules of allyship. One is there's no such thing as a perfect ally. Allyship is about making mistakes, right? So you're always going to make mistakes. And the sooner that you accept that and you get comfortable with discomfort, you're going to be a better ally, right? But and then the second rule of allyship, we talked about kind of the ongoing practice, is constantly adjusting, right? Allies are constantly adjusting their behavior based on something they learn or based on something that is said out there. So to me, you have to, it's hard. It's hard not to be an expert. It's hard when you're afraid to say the wrong thing. Tell them that you're open to learning. So one of the things that Scott and I talk about all the time is tell people you're engaging in a study on allyship. You want to be a better ally to this population or that population. And that's a great way to open the door so that you cannot, I agree, no, you cannot proclaim yourself an ally, but you can proclaim yourself an ally apprentice and that you're trying to be a better ally.
Absolutely. I'll just add to that, yes, you might be judged, Sean, but the reality is you're actually being judged by when you don't step up and, say something or you sort of avoid a situation that the reality is most people in the room are like, oh, somebody needs to say something. And so being the person who's willing to make a mistake or recognize you've said something in a meeting, for instance, and you're like, oh, I know I used the wrong word here. Quickly, the best thing is, Amy was talking about quickly admitting it, correcting yourself, apologizing, just doing that. You naturally, as an individual, you learn to change your behavior only if you're correcting yourself out loud. And then also people see that and they actually really respect when you say, I am so sorry. I think I just stuck my foot in my mouth. I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to use some different language here. And people it builds trust, right? Okay, you're willing to show that you've made a mistake and can correct it, acknowledge it, and then start again. And that's a process we all need to go through in all types of learning. And so just go ahead and have those, awkward moments and have the hard conversations when they come up. Just own it and do it fast.
One thing Kim did last year that is forever etched in my memory. We've gotten off phone calls, Zoom calls several times and burst into tears because this is hard. This is uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. If it's not uncomfortable, you're not learning, you're not growing. Kim one day so bravely got up at the start of one of our webinars and publicly said to, I think it was an audience of several hundred people, we're probably going to say something wrong today. Please call us out on it. And I thought that was so brave and so vulnerable. And it created this, diffuse the situation for everyone of we're trying our best here, but you have permission to call us out. And I think modeling that as a leader takes away some of that anxiety of, I might say the wrong thing. You probably will say the wrong thing, but own it, as Kim said.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And by the way, I also want to call out somebody for stepping up and taking a risk here, and thank Jorge for asking the first question today, and Alana and Teresa as well. So I think this actually kind of transitions us very well into the next aspect of what we wanted to talk about, which is making allyship real. So Jorge asks, how can we act in the workplace to actually put empathy and allyship into practice? Oh, yes. And so I actually wanted to for this section, Jorge, to start with a little bit of a real life experience that people have in the workplace. And so I'm hoping, Erinn, that you might be willing to answer this question, because I think that you could maybe speak to times that you've either experienced allyship or seen other people act as allies. I think, given your role as former chair of CFA Boston, I think you'd be a really helpful perspective on this question.
I'm happy to, Sean, and I have to admit, I think everyone on the call is more experienced than I am with the term allyship. I'll fully admit I was one of the folks who had to look it up when Sean kindly reached out to see if I would participate on the panel. And in our prep sessions and speaking with Kim and Noah and Amy and Scott, I already feel like I've learned a great deal more. And at the same time, I've been struck by how much these types of actions have positively influenced my career. And I would say to the point on, feeling nervous about jumping in and whatnot, don't underestimate how sometimes the smallest of gestures, the smallest comment of support can have so much power. And that's really what I've experienced. And, perhaps it wasn't a formal practice or a policy, but it was very much deliberate actions by my senior male colleagues that have materially benefited my career and provided stretch opportunities and really afforded me many opportunities to build on. And so, I'll maybe share an example. I feel pretty fortunate to have not faced many encounters of outright biased against me. Yes, they exist, but I'm going to focus on the things that I've witnessed firsthand where there's been outright support and what it does and the instant credibility it provides, the amplification of a voice and the confidence that it instills in the person being supported, that when you combine that with mentorship and sponsorship, you just have this incredible, powerful form of support. And I'm going to go back to a experience really early on in my career when I was a junior relationship person working on an insurance account and portfolio that was very old school. And I guess what I mean by that is if you envision the board of this insurance company, it was very much one demographic, very much white older men. And, it was my first time meeting them. And I thought for a moment that I was going to be patted on the head at one point. And, we're doing the very formal dinner the night before with the senior relationship person. We had a new portfolio manager on our team that was joining us. And right in the middle of dinner, the senior relationship manager discovers a mix-up with his flights and realizes that he's not going to be able to join the meeting the next day. And this is the once a year big board meeting. And, throughout the dinner, he started really, reinforcing things that I was saying and asking my opinions specifically on topics that were coming up. And then, announced to everyone at the table that, I was going to lead the meeting the next day and that, I was the one who was best positioned to do so, given my work on the account and really, set me up in terms of providing everyone at that table with the fact that I was going to be the credible source of information to lead the meeting. And the board chair, I'll admit, did look horrified for a moment. And I think even our new portfolio manager was in a bit of a state of shock, but he just reiterated my capabilities and knowledge. And, full disclosure, I had 12 hours notice that I was leading a meeting. So I pulled an all-nighter to be ready. But because of the way he positioned me and laid the groundwork and the fact that he didn't try to call in or do something crazy from the airport, he really passed it, handed it over to me and gave me that authority and confidence. And ultimately, that meeting went very well. And I transitioned into that senior role over time. And so just those examples of reinforcing a voice, reiterating something that when a woman, in my case, makes a comment and it wasn't necessarily felt like the room heard it, that kind of jumping in and saying, well, as Erinn said, I agree with that. Those little things all just provide a stage, if you will, to grow in a leadership position. And I've had another example where I was leading a business pitch, and the senior, I was not the senior most person in the room, and there was kind of this deferral, and he actually got up and left for part of the meeting, which very much positioned me as the person leading the discussion. And so I'm just incredibly appreciative to the men who have been my allies, and not only supported me in that way, but also in mentorship and sponsorship type capacities as well. And as I said, those deliberate, intentional, sometimes small, sometimes large things go a long way, as well as being that open voice for feedback, that can go both ways as well.
Mm. Thank you, Erinn. Getting the real life perspective is fantastic. So I'm looking through the questions that people are sending in. Thank you. This is so exciting. I do want to first acknowledge Sean wrote in to mention that we should specifically call out folks with disabilities as a demographic that we need to serve as allies for. So thank you, Sean. That's a very good point, and thank you for raising that to our attention. I see a couple questions in here that kind of all tie in together, and it's about kind of this idea of making missteps or saying something that maybe isn't perceived the way that you intend it to be perceived. So Chris asked about, can you give examples of saying the wrong thing? There's also a question from Teresa about, okay, what if you see somebody else who maybe says the wrong thing? How do you, in a tactful way, address that, whether it's right away or later? I noticed, Scott, that you shared some ideas in the chat, but maybe I'll turn it to you if you're willing to kind of give an example and maybe talk about how various people in the room can address something like that happening.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll talk about addressing the room first, because I think that what I wouldn't want for the audience to do is come away from this session and think that you need to be the allyship police, right? And correct a behavior publicly. Sometimes that's not the best way to get that behavior to change, right? So one thing we talk about when we talk about kind of the allyship process is gathering information and being curious. And so oftentimes your first step you take, it might be to call it out. It depends on the context, right? Allyship is really context dependent, but it might be a conversation with the person who made the comment to understand where they're coming from with it. Like, what's the context of that comment? But also the folks in the room who might have been negatively affected, right? To get a sense from them, how did they feel about it? Are they looking for action from you on it? Something like that. In terms of, Amy, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to give an example of that, which is just because something strikes you the wrong way and you're sensitive to it doesn't mean that everybody around you is. And that's why you want to check with the person from the underrepresented population before you say something, right? It's calling out versus calling in, right? Do you call someone out in the middle of a meeting, or do you call them in and do you create a conversation around this, an opportunity for multiple parties to learn and grow through it? Scott, I know you wanted to talk about us being poster children for mistake making.
Oh, yeah.
And we are.
What I can say to that is Amy and I do a presentation, and I explained it in the chat, but just to give you the actual kind of context of the story. So we have a workshop where we talk about a gender lens and developing this gender lens to be an effective ally. And we had a picture that had kind of the male and female gender symbols in a pair of glasses. And we got feedback from a couple queer identifying folks like, hey, like, first of all, it's not a binary, and that gets kind of that kind of like makes me want to check out of your presentation. But then also this idea of using male and female, the recommendation was use man and woman because those are identities that people choose, and not whereas male and female are kind of your sex assigned at birth. So we there's kind of two ways we could have taken that. We could have been offended and said, well, what do you mean we're trying hard to be allies, which is not what you shouldn't do, right? We took the opposite approach, which was, first thanking the person for the feedback, owning the mistake, and then kind of moving forward, telling the story of making the mistake, right? So that you can model for the folks that you're in an allyship workshop with it. It's not about being an expert, right? This is not what this space is about. It's about building one-on-one relationships with people. Amy, in this case, had a strong relationship with this queer identifying colleague who that person felt comfortable giving her the feedback, right? And if there's not that direct line of communication and that vulnerability, you can't grow, right? And you can't get the feedback, right? So those are all things to keep in mind.
I think I've learned that my comments about us all becoming experts were maybe not correct. So I'm learning too with everybody else. This is awesome. Thank you, Scott. Okay, so I'm seeing a number of questions in here, and I think this really comes down to like everybody's particular roles within their organization, and different perspectives on allyship and when you can be an ally in your particular role. So like there's an example, or there's a question in here from Eileen about if you're in middle management, you know, how can you practically implement allyship? And then there's, let's see, another question about, let's see, where is the other question that I saw in here that I thought was along those lines? I just practically showing that allyship is important. So there's a question about, you know, how do we show that allyship is as important as the work that we're doing, you know, as part of our day jobs. And so maybe those two could kind of be combined a little bit in terms of, you know, if you're somebody in middle management, what can you do? If you're somebody who's entry level, what can you do? If you're a very senior person in the organization, what can you do? And I know that that's a huge question to ask, but I'm going to throw it out there to all of the panelists, and maybe Kim and Noah, do you want to take the first crack?
Sure. Well, first of all, just stating the facts, diverse teams perform better. They're more productive, they're more innovative, and so it actually should be your work to be a better ally, to have your team have a culture of inclusivity, because you're actually going to perform better as a team. And I think stating that and understanding that this is important not only for us all just to be better humans, quite frankly, but it'll actually make us all better at our jobs if we have more diversity. Diverse teams are shown to come up with better ideas than homogenous teams. And that is, you know, scientifically proven. Just recently, there was a study that showed diverse executive teams are 33% more likely to be more profitable, to have above average profits, pardon me. And then the other piece is that, you know, going back to the notion of the verb of allyship, it demands that you move from conversation to action. It's one of my favorite lines by Emmanuel Acho. And if you're looking for more resources, his YouTube series, his book, brilliant. And actually, one of the follow-on lines to that is, it requires you to be willing to risk your privilege. And I'll pause there and I'll say it again. It requires you to be willing to risk your privilege. Whether you are a senior executive or in middle management, if you are a man, you have more privilege. If you are a white man, you have more privilege. If you are a white woman, you have more privilege than other underrepresented and marginalized groups in the room. And so being an ally requires you to take action, but it requires you to be willing to risk some of your privilege. And that might be, you know, somebody thinks you're saying you're speaking out of line to them, or, you know, you're faced with insubordination, but you have to be willing to take that action to speak up, no matter what your role is.
Go ahead, Erinn.
Oh, I was just going to build on that, because I think it's a really great point and ties into, you know, saying the wrong thing. It's doing the wrong thing as well, in the sense that when you act as an ally, it's important in both good and positive things, and when things don't work out too, being part of that team and accepting the consequences of something that seemed like a good idea at the time, but maybe didn't pan out the way that you thought it would. And I certainly have personally benefited from that, and that, you know, not feeling alone in terms of accepting responsibility for something that didn't work out, although I was a big part of it, but my ally also acknowledging, you know, their role, and you know, that can be really powerful as well. And to your point, you know, that's accepting both sides of it. It's not always just on the up and up, but it's support in all forms.
Thank you, Erinn. Amy,
Sean,
did you?
Yeah, Sean, one thing that keeps coming to mind, and Dion, thank you so much for that comment, and because I think that was a great point, right? It's you can be an ally no matter what your level within the organization. and honestly, it might not directly impact the culture of your organization, but it will definitely impact those around you. But it makes me come back to that original definition of allyship. And when we say, you know, it's support for a marginalized community to which you don't belong. First of all, think about intersectional identities. All of us don't belong to one community or another, right? So I am a woman, I am of a certain age group, but yeah, and I am white. So there are communities to which I belong, communities to which I don't belong. So even if I identify on some realm, there are other identities on which, or there are others on which I don't. So that's one thing. But it also comes back to what is allyship and what does the actual action look like? And I wish that we had a checklist that we could just, you know, upload in the chat and send to you, and great, we'd all be done. We'd all be experts, to quote you, Sean. But the truth of the matter is allyship is personal and it's contextual and it's individualized, and it's your own comfort too, right? So my comfort might be standing up and saying something in a meeting, whereas Scott's might be becoming an expert and having sideline conversations. Whereas you know, Kim and Noah, yours could possibly be marching alongside or doing something else. Any action that is supporting an underrepresented community is an ally action. So just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that I was going to ask, which, you know, considering that you said there's no such thing as a checklist, is maybe a silly question perhaps, but like, you know, if there's one thing that the folks on the call today take away as this is an action I'm going to take, I don't know, there probably isn't one thing. I mean, I think there's obviously many things, but is there any, I don't know, either specific examples or unifying themes that you could share?
Absolutely. First of all, I have to plug my favorite book. I'm gonna steal yours and say, for anyone who wants a fun but really informative read, Jessica Bennett's Feminist Fight Club is a great book. She addresses the topic with humor. And she talks about kind of mansplaining in its full essence. She talks about bropriation, which our friends Dave Smith and Brad Johnson call bropropriation. There are certain things that most people who identify as women in the workplace have experienced. Erinn, you talked about like someone else taking your, saying your idea. How is that different? A lot of times women have their ideas appropriated. So that's the appropriation, right? Be aware of that. A lot of times women are talked over. Be aware of that. Scott, there's things that come up in every single one of our allyship workshops. Can you think of any others that I missed?
I would say that in terms of best practices, flexibility and adaptability are really important, right? So making a note about yourself, and this is hard, right? It's not human nature to be flexible and adaptable and to take feedback well and to kind of iterate on it, right? But I think that that's important. We talked already about living and modeling the mistake-making process. And I really liked what Kim and Noah were saying about kind of the privilege, right? And there is this element of risk taking, right? And I liked, Amy, how you kind of added to that by talking about how, you know, that risk taking is about comfort level too, right? And if you took one big risk and you said something in a meeting and something bad happened and you never did anything, you know, useful again as an ally, that would be a missed opportunity, right? So if you want to build up to it, that's okay, right? If you want to think about your privilege and in micro ways that you can start to kind of use that to make change happen in your company, I would encourage you to do that too, right? So don't feel like you have to, you know, take the biggest risk, you know, right away to be an ally. Yeah, and I think the other thing is, you know, we talked about this too, but try not to think about the knowledge gained as expertise, right? Because we don't need experts in this space. We really just need brave, vulnerable people who will go up to somebody at their company who they're trying to be an ally for and start a conversation to understand what that individual person needs, right? Because if we're not having those conversations with individual people at the company with what they specifically need, I could talk to 5 different Black women at the company I work at, and they would tell me 5 different things that they want to see from me as an ally. If I'm not doing that work, then my allyship is really just kind of rote and standardized, and it's not going to move the needle. So.
Thank you, Scott. There's some really great comments. By the way, I don't know if you caught me typing over here. I noticed my screen lit up, like when Amy was recommending that author. I was like, oh. Anyways, there's a couple of great comments from the audience here. I think so. Ilana talks about how sometimes she's observed that women are introduced only by their first name, whereas men are introduced by their first and last name. Thinking about the way that you, even right at the beginning of a conversation, frame credibility is really interesting, I think. Thank you for sharing that, Ilana. Let's see, women being talked over. If we're an ally being talked over, what's the best tip to overcome that situation on the spot? So yeah, is any tips from the...
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. We think about, this is such an easy one, actually, the idea of an inclusive meeting. When you notice and you're in a meeting and it really does not matter your level, when someone's being spoken over, to say, oh, Sean, I'm sorry, could you hold it? I think Noah was just trying to finish her thought. So be the person who you don't have to be combative about it, but you can sort of, take charge and say something. Or if, Sean, you're really strong in your voice, I let you finish and then I jump in and I'd say, hey, I think Noah was trying to say something. Like, I'd like to come back to Noah. Maybe she could tell us more about what she was saying. And so being the person who, again, you could be pretty junior in that meeting and just mention that I know Noah was saying something, but I would like to hear the end of that of her thoughts. And so bring it back to the forefront.
Or another perfect example is, thanks so much for reiterating the point that Kim just made. You really drove it home, but acknowledging that we've already heard somebody else said it in the room. Let's just call a spade, and you can do that in a passive way or a bit more of an assertive way, depending on your personality. I totally agree with you, Scott. You don't need to be a bull in the shop. I think you can be cautious as you're approaching taking a risk of your privilege.
I think that's such a great example because, I think it comes back to one of the questions we talked about earlier, which is, how can I kind of act as an ally in a meeting without, in a tactful way, right? So like, to me, I feel comfortable saying that. I probably wouldn't be comfortable saying directly to the person, hey, you're not being inclusive, right? But I could say, hey, I think so-and-so is trying to finish their point. So thank you for sharing that. That's really actionable. Now I'm keeping an eye on time, and I think that it's really important that we spend some time talking about kind of best practices in the workplace, allyship programs, successes, challenges. What can you do within your own workplace? What can you can do in a large company, a mid-sized company, a small company? I understand that I was going to do a poll, but I understand that we've lost that functionality. So I'm not going to skip it though. What I'm going to say, I'll ask you the question, and then if folks feel game, maybe you can send in your thoughts just in the chat. So the question is allyship being actively discussed within my organization? And the response would be yes, a lot, or we've got strongly agree, somewhat, little, and none, but there's probably you can respond any way you want. But I am curious to see whether this is a conversation that you're hearing at the place that you work. So please feel free to send that into the chat if you'd like. And now going kind of into the allyship efforts in the corporate world, I think it would be helpful to hear some examples of best practices and what some organizations are doing around this. Amy, would you want to start us off with that question?
Absolutely, and Scott, you can chime in, but we actually partnered with PNC, the bank PNC, to create a curriculum that is now part of our portfolio of offerings in the allyship space. But the reason I want to applaud PNC is because they are definitely a company that doesn't rest on their laurels. They realized early on that they were having a problem. They were getting great inputs in terms of women into their organization, and then they weren't seeing those numbers rise to the leadership. So they said, great, now we worked on the inputs. let's work on the throughputs. How can we address this? That's when they partnered with us. We started creating a full-blown curriculum, which dove into areas of mentorship, sponsorship, intersectionality, all of those topics. And one of the key findings was the men, because it was just men that went through this program, became more aware of other underrepresented populations at work. So instead of saying, great, and resting on their laurels, PNC said, great, now how do we expand this program and think about this as an allyship program for other underrepresented populations? So affirm that really there's leadership from the top and that keeps wanting to invest and grow. It's just been great. The other thing we've seen a lot of organizations do, and I applaud them, is their women's networks have been really driving this. And so we've been working with a lot of organizations where their women's network brought men into the fold. First, they were just attending meetings, and then they said, we know you need your own space too, and why not start putting some men as allies groups is what they're calling them. Now they're calling them allies for gender equity. But the same thing is, it's having a safe space to talk about all this and to learn together. Scott, anything you want to add?
There's nothing that I wanted to, actually, I think I wanted to turn it to Kim and Noah to talk about kind of what do you do if there's nothing going on in your company, right? Because I think Forte, we represent the companies that are really engaged that want to do something. So Kim and Noah, you know, if we're at a company and we don't know how to get started, like, you know, where do we go?
Well, first we would say reach out to a Kahilla or a Forte or others out there. So bring in a third party is always a nice idea. But again, looking at, you know, Amy was touching on it with PNC. First of all, make sure you're recruiting, right? But beyond recruiting, you then need to make sure that you are retaining that talent, which means you really need to create that inclusive environment where people feel like they belong. And they know that there's a path forward for them too, right? Because people leave when they feel not valued, whether they are not, it's the feeling that they have. And so you've got to make sure they feel like they belong. This is a culture they want to be part of. And that, you know, is again through the intimate relationships. It's part like who's on the team. How do I think about, oh gosh, we used to always do happy hours. Well, maybe that's not appropriate on my team anymore. You know, 5 years ago, maybe that was okay. But if I'm really trying to be inclusive, I've got some people who are, maybe they're recovering alcoholics. Maybe there's people who just don't enjoy going to bars. It's uncomfortable for them socially. Let's think of some other activities that can create an environment where people can get to know each other and bond, but it doesn't always have to be around happy hour, for instance. I know that's come up in a lot of companies recently. And then also do things such as, you know, think about starting a employee resource group or these allyship groups. Think about hosting, for those who are really interested in engaging, host a book club. You know, pick a book you want to read together and do a lunch and learn, or that brown bag lunch idea could be on Zoom. Like everything is these days. And then also we really encourage making sure that you have people in the room who don't look like each other so that people can really start to talk and get to know each other on a human level, and they're learning from people who come from different backgrounds. And that can be any, culturally, racially, disability-wise, ability-wise, gender, just really trying to, you know, make those teams fully diverse.
I think it was maybe Scott's comment about the men as allies groups. That's something that's happening here in Boston. So, you know, this is not somewhere else. Another group that I'm a part of is the Financial Services Women's Executive Alliance, and that's got representation from 12 of the largest financial services organizations here in Boston. And I'd say about a third of us currently have an allyship program in place or group. And probably another third of us are working on it. So I don't know, I'm really excited about it, frankly. And the other trend I'm seeing, not that I should be saying anything because you guys know so much more than I do, but the other thing I've noticed is that the allyship groups started out as men as allies to women, but have now been increasingly moving toward allyship to many different groups. So I think that's super cool, and would love to talk about that further to anybody who wants to know about it in the future. So I want to jump all the way back quick to a question that Ilana asked like right in the beginning and that I just was so excited I missed. And the question was, if a person needs an ally, what can they do? Like, how can they invite other people to serve as their allies? So I think one way is this kind of high level, launching a program, starting a book group, et cetera. But I'm guessing maybe that Ilana is asking more about, you're the person in the room that gets talked over all the time. How can you reach out to like a colleague of yours that could be an ally to you? So any thoughts? Let's see, maybe who should start? I don't know. Whoever goes off mute first.
I'm happy to speak. I think be vulnerable, ask. You don't ask, you don't get. That was my late father's saying, and I think it applies to pretty much everything in life. Don't just wait to be tapped on the shoulder for the promotion that you deserve. Ask for it. If you're finding you're being spoken over in the room always, go to somebody you trust and say, will you be my, my confidant in the room next time? And, stand up for me and I'll stand up for you. You've got my back and I'll have your back. But I think, ultimately you don't ask, you don't get. And I think if you need help, if you want to ask for and get what you deserve, ask.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that I think it's really important to be an ally, right? So if you're going to, it's one thing to ask someone to be an ally, but you can also model yourself being an ally to others, right? So there's always going to be people that aren't exactly like you based on different dimensions, whether it's ability level or culture. And being an ally, if you start to model that behavior of being an ally for someone else, some of it might kind of happen, right? Where that culture then becomes pervasive. If that doesn't work, then yes, definitely ask for what you want. I want to underscore what you said there, because I think that's so key, is you have to be vulnerable.
Thanks, Amy. And the other thing that that this gets me thinking about is, that it's not the responsibility necessarily of the person who needs allyship to be asking for allyship. In fact, it's all of our responsibility to be doing this. And so I just want to make sure that that's clear. Let's see. Okay, I want to ask about people who work in companies that are smaller, because some of us work at gigantic organizations, some of us work at very small RIAs or very small organizations that might not have dedicated HR resources, might not have a diversity and equity inclusion program or chief diversity officer. So what would you say to somebody in a small organization about how they can kind of get allyship off the ground in their organization? Let's see, maybe I'll start with you, Kim and Noah.
Sure, I sort of answered it just a little bit ago with Tucker threw me the question, but really, I would say just from a senior leadership perspective, if you are really interested in allyship, is start to model it. Amy was just saying that. Start to show it, start to do the little things in meetings, making sure you're being inclusive, being thoughtful. What we've heard from a lot of people in the allyship programs we've run is, especially very frankly for the older white men, is they said, I've just honestly never thought about it. So pausing, thinking about it, recognizing, maybe I am speaking too much in this meeting, or maybe I am speaking over people, or maybe I never took into consideration. So I think it really starts in small companies, start on the individual level, and if leaders can model it, it's just going to flow through all levels.
And even, look at your calendar, look at, who's coming to the meetings, who's excluded from the meetings, and why. I think there's so many actions that we can all take. Again, regardless of your seniority, regardless of your level, there are many small steps along the way that add up to big things, to create a culture of inclusivity, to create a culture of humans committed to being better humans, which at the end of the day is what allyship is. We're all trying to become the best humans that we can be. And I think, again, to, piggyback off Kim's point, commit to doing learning and unlearning. So there are 12,000 million books out there. Pick a few to start and read them collectively, discuss them collectively. How did this make you feel? What can we do as a result in our team or in our company, depending on your position?
I think that's a really important point, and this idea of just embodying it as a culture, and maybe it's through the DE&I lens that we're focused on it now, but it's really to your point, Noah, it's about creating an inclusive culture that supports diversity, and then the positive positive forces that reinforces and builds on is really powerful.
All right, I'm wondering if we can sneak one more question in here, which is, so we've got, like I said, some people are working, we've got folks from all over the spectrum, I think, represented on today's call. And so what about somebody who maybe is really involved with DE&I right now? Like they're in a women's network and a Black employees network. Maybe they work in HR, maybe they, I don't know, have some level of ability to shape DE&I strategy at their organization. So what's the best way to integrate allyship into a broader DE&I strategy? And maybe if you don't mind, Kim and Noah, maybe I'll come back to you on that question.
Oh, sure. I think look at your policies for recruiting diverse talent, first of all, and then look at, okay, well, what you measure is what you manage. So look at, are we retaining diverse talent? Measure it. And then are we advancing diverse talent? And so first have a look at, quantifiably, where are you? Set a baseline. And then once you've got the baseline, you can look at, okay, well, how do we do better? What are our quantifiable goals to recruit more diverse talent, to retain more diverse talent, and to advance more diverse talent? Set goals and state them publicly, because then you're held accountable to them. And then it's about, okay, well, what are these small actions that we can all collectively commit to, whether it's just in your team, whether it's in your business unit, whether it's in your whole company, in order to work towards that. Because again, at the end of the day, diverse teams perform better.
Thank you. All right, well, I'm a big believer in respecting everybody's time, especially, all of you in the audience who spent this hour with us. I think it's been a fantastic discussion, and I really want to thank Kim and Noah and Scott and Amy and Erinn. I mean, I learned a lot. So let's see. So one housekeeping thing is there's going to be a survey that you should all see in your inbox after this call, and would really, really appreciate it if you'd just spend a minute or two filling out the survey. And in particular, any feedback and comments about future events that you might want to see. Like, would you like to see an allyship event specifically to folks with disabilities, or people of color, or more on kind of strategy, DE&I strategy, or more on how an individual can be an ally? We'd love your input. But with that, I realize we've hit the hour, and thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks.